actually, I won't talk that much on the epidemiological work and contact tracing. I will talk a little bit about it. I'll talk also a lot about some of the work we've done in the space of drug discovery for antivirals. And there are some interesting shared lessons I'll try to talk about. So Mila, the institute that I co-founded, has about 600 researchers, mostly grad students, working on machine learning, and many of them chose to explore how they could be of use with respect to the pandemic in many different projects. So I'll talk about drug discovery, but also some of the underlying questions in biology to understand better how drugs can interact and can be considered as interventions in cell biology. And then the work that I mentioned in collaboration with epidemiologists to try to gather data that could help understand better the transmission mechanisms of the disease and provide early warning signals using self-reports from individuals on their phones. Finally, there are other projects that took place at Mila on the evolution of the different variants and profiling of the viruses. All right. So let me start with a fairly high-level suggestions of where AI can help us to prevent other pandemics, focusing mostly on the aspects that I know about based on my first slide. So I think there's a huge potential for speeding up and improving and reducing the costs of drug discovery and target discovery in the context of looking for therapies. There is also a very high potential of using machine learning to improve on epidemiological models by exploiting large sources of data one may collect from things like phones or other sensors. One thing that we started doing but didn't really have time to go and work, but we have the expertise to do, is to apply the work in reinforcement learning to discover good policies. So how should an individual behave in such a way as to yield the best protection for their community, and what should governments do? There's now a lot of data that is being collected about different policies that governments have enacted, and we could be using these kinds of things, and there are some works in that direction. One area that I'm not an expert in, but I've seen a lot of interesting work, and I think is going to be important as well, and that's connected to the epidemiological aspect. When you're thinking about how individuals could react to the information that can be processed with AI about their risk level, is the use of all kinds of sensors, which we've heard about in this workshop. In general, beyond that aspect, I think for all kinds of therapies, the progress in biotechnologies could help us provide much more personalized treatments based, for example, on the specific immunological history and response and genotype of the persons. For example, to figure out what stage of the disease they are, and what will be the best treatment for them, given what we know about their response of their immune system. There's also a lot of work, which I won't talk really about, on using AI for streamlining healthcare management, often combining AI with operations research. And there's also work closer to what Emma was talking about, to try to predict the evolution of viruses that could be threatening. All right. I'm not going to cover all these things. Let me focus on mostly the drug discovery part and a bit about the epidemiology part. So these are different areas where we need progress in AI. So if you're looking for places where funding should go, I think this is the idea. There is research that could be greatly expanded on how machine learning can be used to model molecules, from the small molecules that we can use for drugs to small and long proteins. And the molecules could be used as inputs or outputs of these systems. For example, to predict properties of these molecules or to generate new candidate molecules. An example of technology that is very popular for this these days, based on deep learning, is graph neural nets. A second area of research that I find very exciting is the use of machine learning to help speed up and potentially exponentially speed up the search in the space of molecules. As you probably know, the space of molecules is huge. Like drug-like molecules is maybe like 10 to the 60 possibilities. There's no way we can enumerate them. So instead of trying from a large list of potential molecules, you really want to use methods that allow the search to explore just the combinations that are most promising based on the data that has been acquired. And the interesting aspect of this, which also makes it logistically more complicated, but forcing us to collaborate more, is that there's going to be this loop with, on one hand, say, machine learning experts that use their algorithms to propose candidates. And on the other hand, say, medicinal chemists or biologists who will run assays and provide results that create new data, additional data for the machine learning. And this loop now can be thought as a integrated system where there may be humans in the loop, but the point is that when you design the machine learning part, you want to take into account the fact that there is this loop, that you will have a chance to propose multiple times batches of candidates. So, and that connects with fundamental questions in AI about exploration that come up in reinforcement learning, but also active learning. These methods have been used in industry, what's called sequential model optimization, Bayesian optimization. Lots of interesting research there that could be translated in drug discovery. In terms of fundamental questions in machine learning, some of the issues that come up, so that's my third bullet point, are about what we call, and it's a very hot topic in machine learning research these days, out of distribution generalization. What happens when you train on some data, but then really the predictor you get, or the generator you get, you'd like to apply in setting, which we call like a transfer setting, where you have much less data, or maybe even no data at all. So you want to generalize out of distribution. And there are many reasons why this may happen. For example, when you're searching, as you search, you're sort of expanding the frontier of the places you visited, and it's always kind of new stuff. But also, in many of these applications, we have the issue of many small data sets, and then we want to apply what we've learned to another small data set, and that's another kind of transfer problem. The fourth area has to do with the epidemiological aspects that I mentioned at the beginning. So we're going to be building these epidemiological models, and these models could include knowledge from epidemiology as well as parameters that can be fitted to data. And again, so machine learning can be used there in actually quite interesting ways. But then what we want to do is to learn policies, like what's the optimal way for an individual with some partial information that is available to that individual to behave. Like, should I go into quarantine, or should I stay at home, or something in between? And when should I do it based on the information that is at hand? And similarly, for governments that they take high-level decisions. And then all kinds of interesting research questions come up, which actually come up in robotics, where you have a similar scenario where you can create a simulator of like 3D world for a robot, but you can train your learner on the simulator, but the simulator is not the real world. So the epidemiological model is not the real thing. And somehow you'd like to set up your whole system so that when you take your policy in the real world, it's not going to crash because of the mismatch between reality and models. That's a very interesting area of research in AI that is ongoing and I think could be useful here. Finally, the last bullet point I want to mention is regarding modeling of the data, in the sense that it's different from just trying to make predictive models, but actually build models of dynamics, for example, cell dynamics, and understanding how interventions like drugs or other events can influence those dynamics. So that means introducing causality. And causality is like an old topic in science, of course, but in machine learning, it's very recent that people are trying to take causality ideas into things like deep nets and so on. So that's fairly new, and I think it's going to be quite important in many of these applications for obvious reasons. All right, so that was like the science part that I know more about, but there are other sciences I think that are going to be important. So these are examples of non-AI advances that really matter to successful application of AI in these kinds of endeavors. So robots, I mean, you think robots is AI, but actually it's like a different field. It could use AI as well, but so you need robots for two things. You may want to use robots for high throughput screening. A lot of that is happening these days already, and we could improve that. And we see more and more use of robots, including already commercial products, to synthesize candidate molecules. So one of the questions is we may not be able to try all possible molecules, but we would like to restrict ourselves to molecules that we can easily synthesize, that are going to be cheap or feasible. And so if you have robots that can execute a certain set of chemical reactions, then you'd like your search to be based on those constraints. And so there's an interaction between the AI and those robots. Now, there's another way to screen, which may be even more powerful than robots, and that's using biology. So high throughput biological assays in the style of DNA encoded libraries can screen hundreds of thousands or millions of candidate treatments. The idea here is to use the cells, each cell to carry one of the potential candidates, and we can use, we can create, we can change the genomes of those, say, yeast, for example, so that they will produce the things we want. And then we're going to use some chemical or biological assay to identify among a huge number of cells those that carry the right, that do the right thing. So there's a lot of research in this direction, which is obviously far from AI, but crucial because that can generate much more data for each of the batches of candidates. And of course, that can potentially be a huge boost for machine learning and the speed at which we can explore that huge space. Already mentioned sensors, which again, give us input data for all kinds of applications of AI that are relevant. And then there are some things that are less technical, but have more to do with the legal infrastructure or the regulatory infrastructure to make sure that AI researchers can get potentially controlled access to the relevant data. So, I mean, patient data is always difficult, but even assay data can be a problem. There's not enough sharing, so open science frameworks that force sharing and also do the right compromise with privacy where it matters need some work. I know time is my time is going quickly, so I'm getting close to the end. Now I'm going to step back here from the science and go more towards the role of governments, academia, and philanthropy. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, for example, in drug discovery, a lot of the work and the investment goes through companies that are trying to maximize profit usually. And that works well for a lot of things, but sometimes it's not well aligned with public health objectives. And this is where governments, academia, and philanthropy need to step in. They need to invest in public good initiatives that are aimed at filling the gap where industry is not doing it. And an example I'd come back later is research on antibiotics, which essentially has been dropped by industry in the last 20 years because it's not profitable, but can really have a huge impact on society in the coming decades. But in general, infectious diseases are not well served by our current economic incentives. So we need not just investments by governments and in the right R&D, but that investment, if it goes to companies especially, needs to come with some strings attached to make sure that the money is going to serve in the most optimal way towards these public good objectives. And essentially, the most important part of this is that the work that would be funded needs to be done in full transparency, meaning that the full scientific results of what has been done need to be shared, and the full experimental data, not just like the final molecule that was found, but everything, every assay needs to be shared. If you want to do AI, machine learning based AI, you absolutely need that kind of data to be shared and coordinated among the different groups. So another related point here is the way government tends to fund these things is with grants, and grants work fairly well in academia, but when grants are used to fund private companies, I'm not sure that the money is always best used in the best possible ways. You just write a report that shows what you've done, but since there is no incentive to do the best possible job, you might not do it. And so I think the solution is to change the funding system so that you get funded for your costs, but then if, say, you discover a molecule, a drug that down the line saves millions of lives, you're going to get an additional reward. Just like if you were a company and you're going to get profit if ultimately the drug you worked on works out. Governments, of course, also need to be concerned about coordinating R&D efforts, data collection, sharing of data, benchmarks, and all these things that may not otherwise happen without somebody on top.
Yoshua,
last slide.
Thank you. Sorry, last slide. Thank you.
Last slide. So the last thing I want to mention is international coordination. Yeah, things like pandemics are global threats. It should be a no-brainer that we need to do the things I've been talking about, not just at the level of individual countries, but across the planet. And so we need to work with international organizations, create new ones if necessary, and not just like on the, for example, World Health Organization, but also things that deal with the World Trade Organization because they have to do with IP and licensing. Yeah, I mentioned already antibiotics, and so I'll stop here. I just mentioned that there's a committee that I'm co-chairing of the Global Partnership on AI that is focused on AI and drug discovery, and we're working on a report to propose to create an international organization to coordinate at the international level government funding of these kinds of research efforts in AI-driven drug discovery. So thank you for listening.